Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Friday Fellowship with Claremont Christian Fellowship. It's great to be here with you, all of you who are watching live, and anyone who's watching this recorded later. I don't know about you, it's been just an emotional roller coaster over the last couple of weeks with bad news and things that many of us have been wrestling with, and in terms of violence and oppression in our country, and then also just living life, right? I'm, for one, am very happy that spring is here and summer is coming. And maybe some of you feel like we're making that turn a little bit in the semester. So thinking about all of you at this time, wish I could be with you in person, but we're here together on the stream, and that's good. So I'm going to invite us to begin the meeting tonight by taking a moment just to stop and be present to God. Bring yourself into this place in any way that you need to in order to receive what God may have for you tonight.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Claremont Christian Fellowship, and we are so glad that you could join us today. And it's so great to see everyone after what's been a long week, and I hope that our time together brings you some restoration. My name is Thumim. I use she/her pronouns, and I'm a senior at Pomona, and I'll be your MC for today. So let's get right to the announcements. So, as always, the first announcement is that we will be hanging out together on Zoom. So, please come join us after fellowship. It will be great to just be with one another and share space and play games. We played a lot of Among Us last week, and I think that will be repeated. And the link to the Zoom will be in our Facebook Messenger chat, and also it's already in the private group. And if you are not on these platforms and would like to join us, please let us know and we can add you to them. And the second announcement is the workout with Matt, which will be tomorrow, Saturday at 10 a.m. like it usually is. And this is a great way to come take care of our bodies and be in community. And it's a very encouraging space and not at all competitive. So please don't feel shy to join us. And the link to this will also be in the Messenger and the Facebook group. And third announcement is that next week it will be the last talk in the series we have going on called Reconstructing Christian Ethics. And our speaker will be Don Abrams, who is a class of 2016 alum. And he will be speaking on undoing the Christian love affair with hierarchy and power. And when I first saw this title, I was just like, oh, that's going to be amazing to just listen to. And I hope you all feel the same way and will join us to listen to Don. Don is a very powerful speaker and is doing amazing work and with the church with projects such as Pride in the Pews, which you should check out if you have not. Please tune in next week to be able to listen to his message. And our fourth announcement will be leading for CCF. So it is that time of year where the year is winding down and we're starting to think about next year. And if this is something you'd like to consider being a community group leader, I would encourage you very strongly to start thinking about it and maybe planning for it. And you can contact Lorraine for a reflection sheet to also try and think about whether this would be something that you're interested in and would be good for you. I led CCF or community group my sophomore and junior year, and it was just a really good time to deepen my faith and form really strong bonds with other CCF humans and be in community with one another. So I would encourage you to consider it. And for next year, it will actually look a little bit different. Rather than weekly Bible study, the community groups will be focused on like actual community building and being with one another. As you can see on the screen, there's a few different roles that you can think about. And so I would very much encourage you to consider being a leader next year. And now we will go to the talk.
All right, so tonight we are continuing our series, Reconstructing Christian Ethics. A few weeks ago, Chris spoke on Christian sexual ethics, and last week, Danny Nazary spoke on, is it possible to spread the gospel in a non-oppressive, non-Eurocentric way? Both of those talks have been really thought-provoking and worth a watch if you haven't yet. Tonight's speaker, Matt Bush, spoke for us last semester on Black Lives, moving from comfort and complicity to compassion and confrontation, and has generously agreed to speak for us again this semester. Matt majored in econ and sociology at Pomona and graduated in 2011 and would have loved to return to Claremont for his 10-year reunion this year if it weren't for COVID. He currently lives in Oakland and works as a people and culture consultant. Thank you so much for joining us again tonight, Matt.
Thanks, Lane, for the introduction, and thank you for having me back. It's great to be connected with you virtually once again. As Lorraine said, I would have loved to meet you all in person this spring for my 10-year reunion, but it will have to wait for another time. I'm very excited to be with you here today. If you were part of the talk that I led last fall, you know that I have a lot of interest and passion around racial justice. And I also wanted to take time to honor what we have been, collectively grieving right now with the spike in anti-Asian violence and racism that we've seen, fueled a lot by COVID-related xenophobia. And I'm grateful that you all have leaders like Chris and Lorraine, who I know from personal experience from my time as a student there, what seems like a lifetime ago, that you're under capable and compassionate leadership that will help navigate through these difficult times. I am someone of Asian descent. My grandfather immigrated to the United States from China almost 70 years ago. And his experience of coming to this country and having his kids bullied at school for being Chinese and having rocks thrown through his windows, and a man who celebrated his 95th birthday this past Saturday. The fact that we still endure these things, I'm sure is very painful for him to see. And I eagerly would love us to continue to pursue a righteousness and repair from all these racist attacks that we're seeing as we continue to go through that and navigate that together. And which leads me to the talk today. It's reimagining the prison system from a Christian perspective. But the prison system itself, a lot of complexities there, very much interwoven with capitalism, white supremacy, anti-Black violence, and then also inspirations as well from the ancestral oppression of anti-Asian xenophobia and racism as well. And so as we dive into that, I wanted to begin with a footnote of the entire history and the current state of the American prison industrial complex is too complicated to get into in a short talk. So I, of course, would advocate for continued education outside of this talk. After all, our knowledge when it comes to this match the complexity of the situation itself. But I will be giving an overview of some takeaways before we go into the main keynote around how Christ compels us to reimagine incarceration. So the roots of modern day incarceration stem from many different inspirations. This is an image of convict leasing after the emancipation of slaves. The 13th Amendment in the US Constitution, which was passed in 1865, it prohibited slavery, but there was a loophole in there around exemptions for people convicted of crimes. So as a response, Southern states quickly passed Black codes or laws that would disproportionately punish Black people for crimes as minor as breaking curfew, loitering, and vagrancy, and basically put them back into slavery and producing labor for profit. And this ensnaring of Black bodies in chains set the foundation for what we now know as not quite convict leasing per se, but prison labor gets a lot of its inspiration from the practice of convict leasing. So the blueprint of today's modern day incarceration does have some inspiration from practices as old as convict leasing, as well as Japanese internment, taking the intersections of anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism in this. This is an image of a Japanese internment camp. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which led to over 120,000 people of Japanese descent rounded up and put them in internment camps. Over 60% of these people put in internment camps were US citizens, and 0 people were convicted of espionage or sabotage during World War II. And the connection between this practice of internment camps and today's prison industrial complex is that these internment camps actually created the blueprint that was the inspiration for today's private prison system, which the out of sight, out of mind component of these internment camps was very appealing to people who wanted to incarcerate people because it was out of public sight. That's why a lot of private prisons are usually out in the boonies in the middle of nowhere. It got inspiration from Japanese internment. So the legacy of anti-Black and anti-Asian racism are both manifested in today's prison industrial complex. And so there's a lot of intersectionality when it comes to this subject as well. I did mention that I'm not going to do a comprehensive overview of incarceration, but there are a few key facts I think are important to understand as we go into it. The first key fact that is important to understand about incarceration in the US is that no other country incarcerates more people than the United States does. We are a uniquely punitive state when it comes to incarcerating its own population. And it's not just based on prison population total, which we are number 1, but also prison population rate. And this number fluctuates. The number varies between 360 and 720, depending on where you're looking at. But regardless of the cutout, the US also leads the world in the proportion of our population. This number here is 639 per every 100,000 residents in the United States, which is the most in the world. If you break it out, how does it actually stack up in the world? 1 out of every 5 prisoners in the world is incarcerated in the United States. So we are responsible for 20% of all incarcerated people. So the magnitude of our prison industrial complex is quite large in the world. Another key fact I think is important to recognize is that a lot of what our current US prison system is today is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. As you can see in this graph here, post the war on drugs and law and order rhetoric used after a spike in the 1980s, we actually see that the rates of incarceration we have today are not something that have been around our country necessarily forever. Your parents remember a time before we considered drugs to be this huge social issue, and they remember a time when our incarceration rates were not at this rate. At least I hope they do. I think I have it in mind about how old your parents should be, but if not, then it makes me feel very old. So I think that it's important to realize that a lot of what we currently envision our incarceration system to be, there is proof of concept that it can be better based on other countries in the world that exhibit that it does not have to be this cruel. And also we've seen evidence that it does not have to be this cruel or this big here in our own country. Another thing that's important in terms of, again, intersections of this and racism, as well as I mentioned before, people of color and poor people are disproportionately targeted and punished by our criminal justice system. As you can see in this figure here, you can see the likelihood of imprisonment in the United States based on different demographics such as gender, race, and things of that nature. And there are many statistics that back up that a lot of it is very much related to race. For example, Black people are almost 4 times more likely than white people in the US to be arrested for marijuana possession, despite the fact that Black and white Americans use marijuana at almost identical rates. So same crime, same drug, but one group is far more likely to be persecuted for that than another one would be. So that's another key fact I think is important to understand about what exactly it is that we're trying to tackle here with the prison system. And again, a lot of information coming here. But this is what the current picture of incarceration looks like in the United States. There are about 2.3 million people incarcerated right now in the country, broken out between state prisons, local jails, and then federal prisons as well. And I know it's really hard to read. The point of this is not to get every single, violation or different thing in there. I just wanted to give you a cutout of what this looks like. And this is from the Prison Policy Initiative. So if you wanted to, on your own time, look more into it, you absolutely can. But one of the things that drives this picture of how we incarcerate this many people is greed. Private prisons are paid a per diem for each bed that they have, and they have quotas for how many of them must be filled on every single day. So that fuels incentives to arrest and incarcerate people. Prison labor is extremely profitable, and one of the largest and fastest growing incarceration sectors is in immigrant detention, primarily through ICE, which is one of the most profitable forms of incarceration. ICE is incredibly profitable immigrant detention for incarceration companies, which are often publicly traded, are one of its most lucrative branches. And we found that as we have built more prisons, we have gotten better at filling them. We are incarcerating more and more people over time, despite the fact that crime rates have been falling relatively consistently over the past few decades. While there are occasionally spikes here and there, usually correlated with recessions, collectively, we are actually a lot safer than we were about 30 or 40 years ago when you look at crime rates. So it is not because crime is rising. We are simply getting better at incarcerating people. And if you focus on jails specifically in that one little orange column there, one of the things that's interesting to note about incarceration that most people do not know is that when you look at local jails, 75% of people who are in jails have not been convicted of a crime. A majority of them are being held awaiting trial and are simply there because they cannot afford bail or are being denied bail. And so it also is a very oppressive system because some people are in captivity, are incarcerated simply because they do not have the means to afford to get themselves out of it, not because they have been found guilty of a crime. And that is a system that is very exploitative and devoid of any semblance of what you might call just. Some of you may know who this young man is. His name was Kalief Browder. He's one of the most well-known cases of how unfair and unjust and cruel this system is. So he was a teenager who was arrested under the suspicion of stealing a backpack and was held pre-trial in Rikers Island, waiting trial for 3 years. And he initially was offered bail, but his family could not afford it. So he could not get out of jail. And then once they managed to borrow money from a neighbor, his bail was actually rescinded due to a previous larceny charge when he was 15 years old. Basically, that probation barred him from bail. So he stayed in Rikers Island for 3 years, 2 of them in solitary confinement, getting beaten by guards, getting in fights with inmates. And eventually, once it became clear that they could not get a charge to stick and they could not convince him to plead guilty for a crime he did not commit, they tried to offer a plea deal where if he pled guilty, they could honor his time served and have some probation and label as a misdemeanor, but he refused to admit to a crime that he did not commit. Eventually, when it became clear they couldn't be charged to stick, they released him. Unfortunately, the trauma from being detained, abused, and battered and in solitary confinement for years, shortly after being released from Rikers Island, Kalief Browder died by suicide. So you can see the human cost and the human toll of incarceration in our country. This is what forces us, as followers of Jesus, to consider what can we do to create a better and more just system. Unfortunately, Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, have mostly been on the side of law and order. Law and order rhetoric, in terms of when this terminology was used more prevalently, began around the late 1950s, primarily driven by Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, who was governor at the time. And they used this rhetoric to mobilize white opposition to the civil rights movement. Basically, the civil rights movement was considered as lawless. It was disorderly conduct, public disturbance, disturbing the peace. There was clashes with police. And so the platform was about restoring the law in counter to this lawlessness. And evangelical Christians have historically been among the strongest supporters of tough on crime rhetoric and legislation. Obviously, Richard Nixon used it a lot. Ronald Reagan was a law and order president. He used that terminology a lot. George H.W. Bush used it a lot. Donald Trump used it a ton. But Trump only knows like 4 or 5 talking points, recycled them all the time. So it's not terribly surprising that he spoke of law and order very frequently. And I know that on the right side, this graphic is pretty small, but what you can see is that white evangelicals are more likely to support the death penalty than the average American. and more so than white mainline Protestants, which are more than Catholics. And if you look at unaffiliated people as a non-religious people, they are less likely to support the death penalty than white evangelicals are. So that is a very whirlwind, very fast overview of sort of what the prison system is today in its current iteration, a little bit about how we got here, and what the relationship between Christianity and the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration is. I highly recommend this book, Rethinking Incarceration by Dominique Gilliard. It was a very formative book for myself to learn the intersections between Christianity and incarceration. And a lot of what I currently know today stems from what I learned from this book. So I wanted to give this book a bump. And if you want to look into it and think that I plagiarized, well, I did, because I learned a lot from it. I also see that Bill Clinton is Law and Order president in the chat. And absolutely, yes, I want to make clear this is not uniquely a Republican thing. There have been plenty of Democrats that also have touted law and order as important things. So I don't want you to think this is purely left and right. We are a very punitive state on both sides of the aisle in that case. So thank you, Joseph, for that note. One question, the overarching question that I have is, what does it mean to reimagine? When I say reimagine the prison system, what does that actually mean at a practical level? What does this exercise look like? Prisons today have become a catch-all solution to our greater social problems. And many of these problems are things that we have created ourselves and are entirely avoidable. So as I go into these next areas, I want you to think about what would it look like and what does it mean to reimagine something as big and with such a legacy as the prison system we have in the United States. And look, and tapping the scripture for inspiration for what reimagination can look like. I want to pull up Luke 15, verses 11 through 32, also known as a story of the prodigal son. Now, for a lot of you wily CCF vets, I'm sure that this is something you're more than familiar with, but there may be people in here who've seen this for the first time. So I'm going to go ahead and just read the whole thing. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me." And he divided the property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. He ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked him what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound.' But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, 'Look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him.' And he said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.'" So this is a very impactful scripture for me personally, because this was the exact passage that actually led me to start rocking with Jesus. I came to know Jesus through Chris and Lorraine's ministry at Pomona College. And this was really the thing that opened my eyes, because before this, and we're really diving into it, I really thought that Christianity was all about punishing people. It was all about what you can't do, you're a sinner, rebuke, punish, damnation. So I just thought, okay, like that is just kind of how they rock. They can do that if they want to. I'm gonna be over here doing anything else. But this really showed me something different about the Christian faith that I hadn't understood before, which is the power of grace, the power of forgiveness, the power of, even when someone has committed a violation, done something wrong, that Jesus sees us through this and does not define us by our mistakes. And one of the things that's so transformative about this parable is it actually begins with a structure that his audience at the time would have been very familiar with. One good son, one bad son. And based on what they understood at the time, they knew how the story was supposed to end, with the good son being rewarded by his faithfulness and all those things, and the bad son being rightfully punished, reaping what he had sown, and being punished for his sin. But Jesus flips the narrative. When the father is running towards the son, they think he's about to run them hands. They think he's about to absolutely go into the son. The son may even be punished by death for what he has done. By demanding his inheritance before his father's death, he has dishonored his father to the point where he basically is saying that you were already dead to me in my eyes, give to me what is coming to me, and squandered it on sinful living. So in this cultural context, this story is supposed to end with the younger son being punished. But the way that Jesus changed the narrative and transforms it, he changes the ending. He blindsides the audience with an ending no one sees coming. Forgiveness. A relationship between father and son repaired, a relationship that was broken, that was fractured by wrongdoing, that had been made whole once more. This isn't the only time that Jesus does this. Jesus was so radical in that he consistently transformed the narratives of what this culture understood at the time, reimagining different and better ways that things could be. One of the great legacies of his ministry is how he liberates our imaginations and expands our ideas of what is possible, what following him could look like, and what a more just world should look like. In another passage, John 8, 1-11, I don't have it up here, but basically it's the story of a woman who'd been caught in the act of adultery, who was brought before him by keepers of the law and the Pharisees. And they basically said to Jesus, this woman's committed adultery. What should we do? Now, they know by the letter of law what's supposed to happen here. This story is supposed to end with her being stoned to death. But Jesus, once again, changes the narrative. He changes the ending with one of his most famous lines, let he who's without sin cast the first stone, which leads to all the people who were about to stone her realizing that they too, that they were not blameless, they are not sinless, therefore they did not have the righteousness that God would have to exact such ultimate justice on this woman as a death penalty. And when they all leave, he then goes to the woman and says that go and sin no more. Basically, she kind of is able to go and continue living her life. There is redemption there. There is restoration there. Whereas the previous ending of the story did not have that chance at redemption. It did not have the opportunity for this woman to be brought back into and reconcile with society. It was so definitive as now you must die. Aren't these endings that Jesus crafts for so much more beautiful than the originals of a son getting, beaten, put into slavery by his father, maybe executed, and a woman being stoned to death by keepers of the law? And what's so radical about this is that the people who bring her to him are the ones who are the foremost experts on that law. Just as, law enforcement and judges today, they know what the letter of the law says that they should do. Jesus challenges us to think about a more redeeming, a more just way forward, and not just going with something because it's familiar and that we know it. So again, I ask the question, what does it mean to reimagine? And one of the ways in which things as powerful as the prison industrial complex demonstrates its hegemony is the way in which it limits our imaginations to the point where we can no longer envision a world in which they do not exist. Oppressive institutions like the prison system often present us with false binary choices. It's either this way or nothing. It's this brutal system of punishment or criminals running free with no consequence. And when people often ask, if we got rid of prisons, what would we replace them with? What they often really mean is, so how will we punish people? And oftentimes we're tricked into believing that punishment is this zero-sum game where either they have this brutal punishment or, again, there is nothing. There's no alternative. But Jesus shows us the power in not settling for things just because they're what we know. We do not have to settle for the false choice of unredemptive punishment or zero consequences and getting off scot-free and victims never having any sense of justice in this world. He gives us a glimpse of what his version of justice in the world looks like. And we can tell, probably by some important statistics and signs, that our current prison system is devoid of repair, restoration, and grace. In fact, it seems pretty antithetical to Jesus' ministry of grace, this radical concept of forgiveness, not earned through deeds or merit, but simply through the power of forgiveness that God grants to us as his children. And so the question is, can we reimagine something by first liberating our imagination from what it currently already knows to come up with something better than what we have today? And a few key talking points about what does this new version of justice, what does a Christian-inspired version of justice actually look like? Well, one important point I want to bring out is that justice in the eyes of Jesus does not equal punishment. There is a version of justice that's very common in the United States called retributive justice. Basically, eye for an eye, you reap what you sow. And people often have a sense of satisfaction from seeing wrongdoers get what they deserve. We seek things like the death penalty or hoping someone goes to jail, not because it will repair the harm they have done, or not because it will undo the damage it has done to the victim, but because we find some pleasure in seeing people get punished. It's almost like when you're watching the Avengers, you can't wait for someone to kill Thanos. Like that in your mind is like, ooh, he can't get away with all this. He murdered like half the galaxy with snap a finger, all of that. And we say that in real life as well. We want to see people rot behind bars. And that is retributive justice. It's the idea that without punishment, there will be some sort of abstract cosmic imbalance. If we do not punish this person, the cosmos are out of balance because we have not made up for the harm that they have done. In the US criminal justice system, punishments, especially this brutal punishment of incarcerating people, is seen as like a panacea for any violation. And it punishes without any objectives around restoration or healing. And this, once again, as I mentioned, is antithetical to the concept of grace. And data has shown us that many Christians, particularly white evangelicals, are more likely to respond to religious leaders they're more likely to respond in our society like how the lawmakers responded to the adulterous woman. They're more likely to respond today as the older brother did in the parable of the lost son, basically outraged that his younger brother was not punished, outraged at the idea that the relationship between his younger brother and his father has been repaired. It's something beautiful, but it does not feel satisfying to him because there has not been this degree of punishment for how the younger brother has lived. And several prominent theologians today and over history have subscribed to the idea that punishment is the key to justice and accountability. And it's a very meritocratic view of justice, which is, again, a bit antithetical to grace, but that's a very controversial topic. It's why there are like a gajillion denominations now. And so this meritocratic view makes punishment and reconciliation codependent on one another. And so a lot of people subscribe to this retributive theology are a lot like those Pharisees, are a lot like that older brother, and are not very similar to the way that Jesus acts in these moments where justice is being called for. And our current justice system is very punitive. It seeks to punish rather than rehabilitate, and it shows in the way in which we view incarcerated people. Formerly incarcerated people are often branded for life. They remain barred from housing, employment, and healthcare upon release. They also often remain under surveillance from the state in the form of parole, for example. The idea of paying your debt to society and getting a clean slate is largely a charade. We do not view people who've been convicted of crimes with a clean slate after they've served their time. They are instead stigmatized and marginalized because of how we define them by what they have done, often by the worst things they have ever done. And Michelle Alexander, author of the seminal book New Jim Crow, points out, criminals, it turns out, are the one social group in America we have permission to hate. They are entitled to no respect and little moral concern. This pejorative and discriminating view of people who have served or are serving time for criminal activity is often more prevalent in the church than society at large. The great irony is that Christianity revolves around Jesus, a falsely convicted criminal who was falsely charged, punitively convicted, mercilessly tortured, and unjustly sentenced to death. Given this, I would think the church would understand the necessity of thinking more restoratively about criminal justice. And that's a very important talking point that she brings up. In fact, if you pick up the Bible, almost the entire New Testament was written by people who were convicted and persecuted by the state. Paul wrote most of his letters to the churches from prison. Jesus was a convict in the eyes of the law. We idolize these saints, these prophets, despite their incarceration. But today, we view incarcerated people as people who are unworthy of our respect or trust in society, often labeled by the things they have done. If you've stolen, you were always a thief. If you've killed, you were always a murderer. And that is not restorative in any way, shape, or form, which brings us to a version of justice that is more in alignment with Jesus' ministry and his vision, which is restorative justice. Justice in the eyes of Jesus is satisfied by the restoration of peace to relationships, not by the pain of punishment. In Jesus, we see a living expression of love, restoration, and reconciliation. Instead of avoiding, confining, and excluding those at the margins of society, he sought, touched out, and liberated and reintegrated them into society. One of the reasons he told that story of the prodigal son was because of how the Pharisees and people were giving him a lot of flack for who he was kicking it with. Prostitutes, tax collectors, lepers, anyone who was seen as like a less than in society. The protocol was to exclude them. These are sinful people who need to be quarantined in these areas. They are not to be mingled with. They are not to be associated with. But Jesus shows the redemption of bringing people back in and not labeling them by who they are, what they have done. And it's not as if justice must be completely devoid of any punitive countermeasures intended to denounce wrong and rectify damage. The Bible and some biblical law does call for some punitive countermeasures from time to time. But the goal of these interventions must be to reconcile and restore the integrity of life and our relationships with one another, not just punishment for punishment's sake to create some sort of sense of balance. It must exist within a paradigm of restoration if you are to have any punitive measures. And restorative justice work has led to a lot of very powerful things, such as reduction in recidivism rates, which is basically if you've been in jail, what's the likelihood that you will re-offend and re-enter jail. It has created alternatives to incarceration. It has led to community healing. We see that restorative justice with this aim shows us that incarceration is not the only way to deal with when there has been a fracture in trust or some sort of breaking of a social contract that we have in our society. There are restorative ways to go about that affirms the dignity of the victim and also the dignity of the offender and brings people together in a way that involves all the parties to heal and restore relationships and disrupt the cycles of harm as opposed to perpetuating them. Because incarceration currently is a perpetuation to the cycle of harm. It is not an obstruction to it. There have been no signs that mass incarceration has led to a safer society in any way. In fact, it's actually gotten worse as society gets safer. So if anything, it kind of has an opposite correlation in that sense, at least recently. And so restorative justice, one that is not devoid of consequences by any means. So I'm not saying let anyone who's offended just do whatever they want, but it has this aim of repair. And we find that there are lots of proof of concepts around the world and in our country about how that is more humane and actually leads to more favorable outcomes than simply locking people up for a defined period of time. One way to think about biblical justice in the Bible is it can be reduced to at least two different kinds of justice. One of them is distributive justice, which is how material possessions and resources are distributed justly in society between groups and individuals. And then there is corrective justice, which is what you do with crime and lawlessness. And so these are two different branches of justice. And now when someone is accused of robbery, for example, today, our minds automatically go to what is to be done with the wrongdoer here. But rarely do they ever wander into the distributive justice part of it, which is what are these systemic failures of our society that put this person in a position of such scarcity that they had to resort to theft. And that's a very important part of the puzzle, is addressing those root causes. Oftentimes, social injustice is what leads to crime and then leads to corrective justice, which our version of that in the country is incarceration. You can see from the demographics around poverty and homelessness, around which people are more likely to be incarcerated. So a lack of social distributive justice is the fuel that leads to the outcome of oppressive and corrective justice in our society. Crystal Marshall has a great quote around how you cannot view these two justices in isolation. I'll read it out loud because I know it might be hard to read. It is vitally important that two domains, social and criminal justice, are not viewed in splendid isolation, especially when seeking to apply biblical insights and priorities to our context. Much of what the Bible says about social justice has direct relevance to the criminal justice system. If we took more seriously the biblical imperative to care for the poor and dispossessed, to avoid the unjust accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of the few, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed by debt or exploitation, we would have less cause to employ criminal sanctions against those on the margins of the community who feel that they have no stake in society. And as we seek to create a more restorative, justice-oriented outlook on our country, I think that it's important to keep this in mind around how addressing the root inequalities of injustice is a major factor in decreasing the amount of incarcerated people in our country. You could, without changing any laws, I think you should change laws, but you could, without changing the laws, significantly reduce the amount of people who fall into this trap of perpetual cycles of harm and incarceration by meeting fundamental needs such as food, shelter, healthcare, mental health care, things of that nature. And the lack of those things is often the driving force behind what leads to crime. As Lorraine mentioned, I live in Oakland, California. I also do local work here around reimagining public safety as part of a task force we have in Oakland. And so we keep our eye on what the state of public safety is in our city. And we've seen a pretty big spike in the last year of violent homicides. And it's driven in large part due to the economic downturn caused by COVID-19, people losing their jobs. As we've seen, that desperation is the source of a lot of what leads to violent crime. Same thing happened back in 2010 at the tail end of the previous big recession that we had. So we see how desperation and a lack in society leads to these violations and these crimes. And I love this quote from Desmond Tutu, where it's a very short and simple quote. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they are falling in. And I think that there is a lot of power in that. Before you get to the whataboutisms of what do you do if someone kills so and such or someone steals so and so, what should the punishment be? What should the punishment be, etc. Focusing so much on corrective justice, we lose sight on distributive justice, the social justice, the upstream issues that lead to the downstream problems. And that is a lot of what Jesus points us towards because of who we see him align with, the marginalized in society, feeding for the poor. He aligns himself, God, with the poor. The key to the kingdom of heaven is those who care for the poor, who care for the marginalized, who care for those without shelter, those without food. And so our systems need to be oriented in a way that are reflective of that prioritization of caring for those who are in need. And so a couple of last notes here. What can reimagination look like? One of them, as I talked about, is addressing the root causes of crime. simply thinking about what are some things that prevent crime in the first place, and you're actually dealing with less of how should we punish people, with simply fewer violations in the first place because people have their fundamental needs met. Second thing we can reimagine is what we consider crimes and why. There are more people than I can count in prison right now for possession of a drug I can go down the street and buy legally in my state right now. And it shows the iniquity of how people have been persecuted for things like marijuana possession when we are trending towards legalization at most state levels and eventually probably the federal level. And it's important to consider what we consider crimes. The Black codes post-slavery show that they wanted to just make random things crimes, where you could be arrested simply for being homeless. You can also get arrested for being homeless today. There was a not far from where you all are right now. Well, okay, never mind. I forgot you guys aren't actually on campus. I'm sorry for bringing that up again, but not far from where your school is. There was recently a homeless encampment clean out in Echo Park in LA, and basically cleaning out the park because of the blight of homelessness. And also it leads to arrests simply for being homeless. And so thinking about the pipelines that feed incarceration, often because of building prisons and trying to hit bed quotas and financial incentives for incarcerating people, we kind of reverse engineer incarceration from the outcome we desire. And what we desire societally, as has been shown, is to put people in jail. And that's why we wind up with a lot of arbitrary crimes and violations. So decriminalizing more things is one we definitely should consider reimagining. Another thing is alternate responses to harm. So if someone has been harmed, what are alternate responses to that beyond incarceration, beyond police intervention, of things of that nature? Going beyond reforms. Reforms are often not reimagination. Many reforms have done very little more than reinforce the system and only increase its legitimacy, oftentimes even increasing the funding for different things like that. In every state where the death penalty has been abolished, for example, it's been replaced by the sentence of life without parole, which is basically another death sentence in and of itself. And so if you think about that as a reform, no more death penalty, now it's replaced by life and parole. So it's not like life without parole. So it's not really a lot of progress in terms of transforming and reimagining the prison system. Also, indeterminate sentencing has been replaced with 3-strike programs, mandatory minimums, which is basically you have to be sentenced for at least this number of years. It's a lot. Reforms oftentimes are a lot like buying a house with bad bones. I know buying a house, something that's pretty hard to do for millennials and Gen Z in the future. Just that's another talk for another time. But say you are buying a house. If you get a house with bad bones, which basically is a poor foundation, no degree of renovations is going to make that a sturdy house. And oftentimes reforms are renovations on a body with bad bones. You can make that house better, but you will not really have a sturdy house until you start from scratch. And so our criminal justice system needs to be deconstructed and rebuilt, not always just having the window dressings changed. And then as a question I like to think about is how close can we get to a world without prisons? I don't know if we'll ever get there, but I think that should be a goal we have in mind, is how do we get fewer people in prison? How do we have fewer prisons themselves and be on a journey where we are moving towards that? And having that as something you imagine is what is a world without prisons? That's what liberates your imagination from the false choice that this thing gives you of we either punish people like this or we have utter anarchy with no accountability. The last talking point that I wanted to bring up is something I think is very important if you engage with this work, is that perfection is not your burden. It's okay to wrestle with things. It's okay to not have a clear answer for every question in the moment. You hear a lot of whataboutisms of, okay, what do you do with murderers? What do you do with this or whatnot? And the question is, why does a very oppressive, flawed, racist system require a replacement with zero flaws and shortcomings? If you get a question when you're exploring things like prison abolition work, like, what about rapists? That question often will shut the conversation down if they're not provided with an airtight, can't fail, satisfying response. If you don't give me a good answer for that question, I simply cannot go through reimagination with you. It's not as if that question is invalid, by the way, but I would challenge the person who asked that question to answer the what about the rapist's question for the system that we have right now. You know, the system we have right now, where out of every 1,000 rapes, 57 result in arrest, 11 are referred for prosecution, and 6 result in incarceration. A system so poor at protecting victims of sexual assault, where victims are so unlikely to receive any semblance of justice that 2/3 of victims of sexual assault do not even bother reporting what happened to them because of the thought of it only leading to more trauma, embarrassment, or frustration. I'm talking about that system. So you want to know what a reimagined criminal justice system would look like in addressing rape as an example. Do you think the current one does a really good job? Do you think that this one is so awesome that it's not worth exploring a better system? Our current incarceration system does not even address that specific challenge, nor has it proven to be a disincentive that reduces crime rates in any meaningful way, remotely consistently. And so I think that the fact that it's so obvious how flawed our own system is enough of a reason for me to not grind everything to a halt around reimagining just because we do not have a perfect answer for everything right in this moment. We may not have a perfect system. And in fact, I know we will not have a perfect system because any man-made form of justice is always going to fall short of God's perfect justice. There are always going to be some flaws, of course. And we may not make that perfect system, but we can make a better one. So creating this infallible system is not your objective. And as I mentioned, it is also not possible, as only God is possible of perfect justice. So it's okay for us to fumble together towards repair, to know how many narratives that exist right now we could transform into something better, more holistic, more healing, and to not be burdened with this idea that we have to have everything figured out right in this moment. Because I fundamentally believe that if we follow Jesus' example, we can create more beautiful narratives, more beautiful endings for the challenges that we have right now. And the solutions that we have, we can replace them with something that's more reflective of God's vision of love, redemption, and reconciliation.
Hey, Matt, thank you so much for that word. Really appreciate all of the thinking that you've brought into this, and it's very helpful for us to hear that from you. I'm going to ask if we don't have a lot of time, but maybe would you be willing to take a couple questions from the group?
Sure.
Cool. So let me drop you out for just a second, and we'll bring you back when we have questions for you. What we're going to do right now is we'll have a song of response, another recording provided for us by Eric Lige. And during that time, take a moment and just bring your thoughts and reflections to mind, bring them before God, or just simmer in them if you want. And during the song, if you're willing, please post a question or two in the chat, and then we'll toss a couple of them to Matt. And if we don't get to all the questions in the time that we have, then maybe we can bring them up again in the chat afterwards. I am going to try to run this video now. I'm restarting it from scratch, so hopefully it works. We'll see how it goes.
Second Corinthians chapter 4 says, I am troubled, yet not distressed, perplexed, but not in despair. I'm a vessel full of power, with a treasure none can compare. Persecuted, but not forsaken, cast down, but not destroyed. I'm a vessel full of power, with a treasure from the Lord. Thank you, Father, for your power. It has resurrected me over painful circumstances that my poor soul could not flee. I've been bruised and battered, but not forsaken. Born in sin, but from sin set free. I'm a vessel full of power. I've got a treasure hidden in me. So thank you, Father, for your power. It has resurrected me. Over painful circumstances that my poor soul could not flee. Oh, thank you, Lord. I'm a vessel full of power with a treasure from the Lord. And you're a vessel full of power with a treasure from the Lord. And we're all vessels full of power with a treasure from the Lord.
All right. So we're back here, Matt, and we've got a few questions popping into the chat. I think you can see them there, but let me just toss a couple at you right now. Our first question comes from Joe. He says, "Hi, Matt. Thanks for coming to speak to us. What do you think restorative justice looks like in the case of child abuse? Any examples of good ideas that rightfully recognize the harms done, but does not dehumanize the offender?"
This is a great question. I have a very long answer for this that I will not get into, but what I can say is that there are some good examples of this. And the main foundation that I have seen, I've seen it most firsthand actually in restorative justice work in Brazil. And I also have worked with a team here in Oakland that's crafted a recommendation around this sort of youth protection that's currently under review by City Council here in Oakland. And one of the main things that about restorative justice for youth, especially when child abuse, is investing in a healing-informed model for the child, which helps them name the harm, address their trauma, and also developing self-determination, which is the ability, which basically giving the youth agency over their own repair, being able to name their own damage, and then also incorporating, if it's a case of child abuse from the parent, for example, it actually helping the child basically instigate the terms and the conditions around repairing the relationship with the parents in that case. Especially in the United States, this is very important because if that relationship is not repaired, oftentimes what happens is the state ends up taking the child and goes into foster care. And I've worked in the foster care system in Oakland I worked in there for 3 years at the college. It's not something that repairs the harm for the child. It only perpetuates it by punishing the parents in this case. So we found the most direct way to do it is by investing in the self-determination, humanity, and dignity of that child first and foremost. And then that child gets to be the one that actually instigates more of a parent relationship with the parents. If it's a case like if it's a stranger's doing it or it's a sexual crime, for example, those are a lot more complicated. Typically, most of the healing is focused on the youth itself, but not in a way it focuses on punishing the offender. It's not as if we're going to hold hands and wait to see if the offender goes to jail, but rather, can we have a healing-centered approach around what has happened to you, how you can heal from it, how you are more than your trauma, and holistically rebuild from there. So I know it's pretty abstract in a sense, but self-determination and a healing-informed approach for the child first is usually the best way that I have seen addressing child abuse from an RJ standpoint.
Thank you for that, Matt. And we know that, as you said already in your message, that we don't expect you to have all the answers to exactly how everything gets resolved, but that's a very helpful and specific way we can move in a different direction. Thank you for that thought. Raul asks this question. He says, "Hi, Matt. Thank you for this insightful talk. Could you share in more detail how your task force is working towards reform?" So you've given us an example or two already, but any other things you want to throw at us?
Sure. So this task force came to be due to our local activists and organizers in Oakland. Other cities have also doing this, where basically it stemmed from the defund the police movements that we had around the country and refunding the community. So their city council approval, they voted on it to establish a task force to reimagine public safety by cutting the police budget from the general purpose fund by 50% and what to do with that money. And so I, along with over 100 other community members in Oakland, worked for 6 months to draft recommendations of different things that we believed would increase public safety. My specific research group focused on things like creating a restorative justice network in the city, basically having drop-in centers that are focused on breaking cycles of harm. It includes restorative justice, what's called RJ diversion, which is if people are on pathways to harm, getting them out of there and working on the healing. It opens up a drop-in center for people who are formerly incarcerated to get resources, because reentry is very hard. Oftentimes resources for people who are incarcerated, they spread via word of mouth and they change all the time. And so to have a dedicated drop-in center for resources to provide reentry support, it involves working in partnership with our indigenous population we have here around land trusts and things of that nature. So at the end, we had over 160 recommendations for city council. My group authored 10 of them, but it basically was a city giving us flexibility to get really, really imaginative for what public safety could look in Oakland. And then we deliberated through things, we voted on them, we improved recommendations, we got community feedback. And so it was a very long process, a little overly bureaucratic, but the recommendations are all over the place. I would be more than happy to, on the Facebook page or Instagram, I can send a link to the website of this task force, which also has a list of all the recommendations.
Thank you so much for that, Matt. We really appreciate it. We're running up against the end of our time here, so I don't think we're going to be able to get to these last couple of questions. Sorry, folks. But we can talk about these more in the Zoom chat afterward if people want to talk about them there or just hang out. But Matt, thank you so much again for the time that you've given us tonight. We know that you are a busy person, and we appreciate the time you took to put all this together for us.
Thanks for having me back. Chirp, chirp.
All right. So bye, Matt. We'll let you go here. And there's a bunch of folks from CMS folks who are grinding their teeth right now at that chirp, chirp. Maybe Pitzer as well. Matt is a passionate. He was an athlete for Pomona Pitzer, so he's got that in his blood, like some of the rest of us. Well, I'm going to hand it over to Thumim to wrap up our time together.
All right. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today and listening to Matt's great talk. I know I learned a lot. And yeah, join us for the Zoom call afterwards. There will be a link in the Messenger chat and also in the Facebook group. And it was very good to see you all today.